Hi. This time we'll do Paul and the Gentile mission in the series Christ's Deity in the Early Church. Some scholars have seen in Paul the first unqualified assertions of Christ's deity. Others, more cautious, point out that even passages which can be translated so as to refer to the deity of Christ allow for other renderings. Even if we adopt the more conservative option, we are still faced with the fact that Paul stopped short of the familiar Christian assertion, quote, Jesus is God, which assertion, we might add, is often the center of dialogue with cultists. And this caution of Paul is the more notable in that the polytheistic milieu of the Gentile mission would allow for the deification of a man, or the incarnation of a deity. We also find in Paul a clear doctrine of the subordination of the Son, for instance 1 Corinthians 11:3 and 15:28, which Arians in the 4th century would later use to prove the essential inferiority of the Son. Though most New Testament scholars assert that Paul certainly believed in the full deity of Christ, they also observe that Paul's tendency to separate Christ from God and to subordinate him to God are no accidents. These mental habits of Paul are his attempts to preserve the essential monotheism of the Christian faith. We, in apologetic ministry, do well to imitate Paul, especially when confronted with Muslims or Jews or Jehovah's Witnesses, among other faiths which see us as brandishing before them some species of polytheism. The great Scottish theologian James Denny had a similar aversion to the imprecise and potentially catastrophic language of popular piety. That's what he called it. Denny said, quote, Jesus is man as well as God, in some way therefore both less and more than God, and consequently a form of proposition which in our idiom suggests inevitably the precise equivalence of Jesus and God does some kind of injustice to the truth. That's what James Denny said about 100 years ago. Nevertheless, the Apostle Paul began the process of giving intellectual and theological justification to the church's worship of a man who was also God. What before had been latent in the church's message was about to become patent in the ministry of the Apostle John. In other words, that which was fairly vague and maybe could be taken two ways in Paul became patent or patent in the ministry of John. So let's talk about John, the second generation of Christians. What is it that causes Christians to jump into John when they need proof texts for the deity of Christ? We don't find such clear assertions of Christ's deity in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, written during the first generation of Christian disciples. Why not? Liberal-tending critics often use this fact to confirm a development in understanding of Christ's person in the early church. The Watchtower and other critics of orthodoxy observe the reticence of these earliest Gospels and of Christ himself as quoted in them, and conclude that neither Christ or his early followers were aware of his supposed deity. But John has his own explanation for the unique content of his Gospel, which contrasts so markedly with the synoptic Gospels, called such from the Greek verb which means going to see together, that is, taking a common view. The Spirit, John remembers Jesus saying that last night, would guide them into all truth, because, he told them, ye cannot bear them now, that is, the truths. This is John 16:12-14. If disciples were not ready to bear the full glory of Christ after 3 years with him, how less those we try to persuade with a face full of proof texts. And remember, our best proofs are from this very Gospel John, written to believers who already had 60 years of thinking and teaching on the person of Christ to prepare them for the Spirit's full revelation of his glory. The apparent date of the revelation, during that same last decade of the 1st century, conforms to the gentle pattern of the Spirit's method with the church. The revelation, not of John, but of Jesus Christ, according to Revelation 1:1, gives us unblushing the full glory of Christ, who is worshipped with God himself by all creatures in heaven and earth, according to chapter 5, verse 13. and who sits on the very throne of God himself, according to chapter 22 of Revelation, verses 1 and 3. But this book too is addressed to the churches, not to unbelievers. And in the next segment we'll talk about the apostolic and ante-Nicene fathers from around 100 AD to 250 AD.